It was a routine patrol on a quiet street when Officer Daniels noticed a scruffy stray dog loitering near the town square, annoyed by its presence and the barking that disrupted the calm. He reached for his pepper spray, determined to shoo the dog away, but the moment the mist hit the dog's face, something unexpected happened. The dog didn't fight back. It ran straight to a man sitting in a wheelchair nearby. What the officer discovered next left him reeling with regret and changed his life forever. The sun was beginning to set over the small suburban town, casting a warm golden hue across the streets. Officer Daniels leaned against his patrol car, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. The shift had been uneventful so far, just the way he liked it, but as he glanced toward the park, a scrawny stray dog caught his eye. Its coat was matted, its ribs visible under the patchy fur, and it was pacing nervously near a bench. Daniels had little patience for stray animals. To him, they were nuisances, often causing disturbances and occasionally posing risks to the community. This one in particular was barking incessantly at passers-by, causing a few pedestrians to quicken their steps. One woman even crossed the street to avoid it. That's enough, Daniels muttered to himself, reaching for the pepper spray clip to his belt. He approached the dog cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The dog turned toward him, its bark faltering into a soft whimper as it took a hesitant step back. Get out of here," Daniel said, his voice firm but not unkind. He raised the pepper spray and gave it a quick press, a fine mist spraying toward the dog's face. The dog yelped and bolted, running toward a shadowy figure in the distance, a man sitting in a wheelchair beneath a large oak tree. Daniels watched as the dog reached the man and pressed its head into his lap, its tail wagging despite the pain. The man, visibly stared, began wiping at the dog's face with a cloth, whispering soothing words that carried faintly on the evening breeze. Daniels felt a pang of unease as he approached, his earlier confidence replaced by growing guilt. "Hey, there, is this your dog?" Daniels called out, his tone more measured now. The man looked up, his eyes clouded with emotion. "Yes, this is Scout," he said, his voice trembling. "He's not a stray, he's my service dog." Daniels froze in place, his grip tightening on the pepper spray. He had just attacked a trained service animal, a lifeline for someone in need. Shame washed over him as he realized his mistake. "Is your dog okay? Can I help?" he asked, his voice softer now, but the man's response hinted at a deeper story. One Daniels wasn't prepared for. Daniels knelt beside the man, and Scout, his earlier bravado replaced with a deep sense of regret. Up close, he noticed the man's frame, frail build, the wheelchair worn from years of use, and the sorrow etched into his face. Scout, despite the irritation in his eyes from the pepper spray, remained focused on the man, nuzzling his hand and whining softly. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice low. "I didn't know he was a service dog." The man gave a faint smile, though his expression was tinged with sadness. "Most people don't see beyond the surface. Scout's more than just a dog to me. Is my lifeline." Daniels felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen plenty in his years on the force, crime, hardship, desperation, but something about this encounter unsettled him. "Can I get him some water or something to help with his eyes?" he offered, genuinely seeking to make amends. The man nodded. "There's a water fountain over there," he said, pointing to a nearby spot. "If you could fill this." He handed Daniels a small, collapsible bowl from the bag hanging on the side of his wheelchair. As Daniels hurried to the fountain, he couldn't shake the image of Scout's loyalty and the man's quiet dignity. Who was this man? And why did his relationship with this dog seem so profound? Returning with the bowl of water, Daniels watched as Scout eagerly lapped it up, his tail wagging slightly despite the discomfort. "Thank you," the man said, stroking Scout's head gently. "He'll be okay. He's tougher than he looks." Daniels crouched down, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What's his story, and yours, if you don't mind me asking?" The man hesitated, his eyes fixed on Scout. "Finally," he said, "my name's Robert. The first was a firefighter for nearly 20 years. My whole life was about saving others, but 5 years ago, during a major blaze, the building collapsed. I barely made it out alive, but I lost the use of my legs." His voice faltered, and he took a deep breath. "I thought my life was over, everything I'd worked for gone." In an instant, Daniels listened intently, his usual skepticism replaced by genuine concern. "And Scout," he prompted. "Scout came into my life 2 years after the accident. Robert said, a faint smile touching his lips. He was a rescue like me, abandoned. As a puppy left to fend for himself, when I met him at the training center, he was skittish, scared of people, but something about him, it just clicked. We were both broken in different ways, and together we started to heal. Robert paused, his hand resting on Scout's back. He's more than a dog. He's trained to help me with daily tasks, fetching things, opening doors, but it's what he's done for my spirit that I'll never be able to repay. He gave me a reason to keep going. Daniels felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never considered the profound impact an animal could have on someone's life. Let alone a dog like Scout. I can see why you care about him so much, he said softly. And why he's so protective of you. Robert nodded, his gaze distant. Scout doesn't just protect me physically. He knows when I'm down, when the nightmares come. He saved me more times than I can count, not just from danger, but from myself. Daniels glanced at Scout, who was now lying calmly at Robert's feet, his eyes still red, but his demeanor serene. I owe you both an apology, Daniel said. I misjudged the situation, and I acted without thinking. Is there anything I can do to make it right? Robert looked at him, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes the best way to make something right is to learn from it. People often see Scout and assume he's just a stray because of his scars and rough coat, but he's a hero in his own way. If you can remember that, if you can see the value in what others overlook, that's enough for me. Daniels nodded, Robert's words resonating deeply. I'll remember, he promised, and I'll make sure others do too. As Daniels helped Robert and Scout settle, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He decided to stay close, watching the pair as they rested on a nearby bench. Scout seemed to sense that Daniels' earlier aggression had given way to guilt and curiosity, and while he kept a watchful eye on the officer, his body language was less tense. Daniels' radio crackled with a routine update, pulling him momentarily from his thoughts. As he responded, Robert spoke up, his voice calm but deliberate. You're wondering why I'm here, aren't you? Daniels turned to him, startled by the directness of the question. I guess I am. Most people wouldn't choose this spot to sit all day, he admitted. It seems isolated. Robert's lips curled into a wry smile. I'm waiting for someone. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Family? No, Robert replied, shaking his head. Someone I've never met before. The cryptic response piqued Daniel's curiosity further. Who are you waiting for? Robert's gaze moved to the horizon, his expression unreadable. The person who abandoned Scout. Daniels blinked in surprise. Wait, you mean you know they're coming here? Robert nodded, his hand resting on Scout's head. It's complicated. A few weeks ago, a friend from the shelter where I adopted Scout reached out to me. They'd recently taken in another stray, a dog that looked strikingly similar to Scout, same build, same scars. They did some digging and found out that both dogs had been part of an illegal fighting ring. Daniel's stomach churned at the thought. He'd encountered cases of animal abuse before, but the idea of forcing animals into violence for entertainment never failed to sicken him. Scout escaped, Robert continued. He must have broken free during one of their raids, but this other dog, he didn't fa so well when they found him. He was in terrible shape, malnourished, scared of his own shadow. But he had something Scout didn't. A collar with an address. Daniels leaned forward, his interest fully captured. And that address brought you here? Robert nodded again. It belonged to the man who ran the ring, but when authorities investigated, they found the property empty. The guy had fled months ago, and they couldn't trace him. I came here because someone mentioned that he might still have connections in the area. I thought if I waited long enough, someone might show up, someone who knows where he is. Daniel's mind raced as he processed the information. You're telling me you're here to confront the person who did this to Scout? Robert's expression hardened. I don't expect to find justice in the traditional sense, but I need answers. I need to know how Scout ended up in that hellhole and why anyone would think it's okay to treat animals like that. Daniels felt a wave of admiration for Robert's resolve. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet he was willing to put himself in harm's way for the sake of his dog. Are you realize this could be dangerous, right? Daniel said cautiously. People who run these kinds of operations don't exactly welcome visitors. Robert gave a small, mirthless laugh. Danger doesn't scare me anymore, officer. I've already faced the worst day of my life. Everything after that is just noise. Scout let out a low growl, his ears perking up as he stared toward a figure approaching from the distance. Daniels instinctively placed a hand on his radio, ready for anything. The figure was a man dressed in ragged clothes, and walking with a hurried, almost nervous gait, he stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting. Between Robert Scout and Daniels, what do you want here? The man asked, his voice rough and wary. Robert straightened in his wheelchair, his tone calm but firm. I'm looking for answers. You ran with the people who did this to my dog. I want to know why. The man's face twisted in a mix of fear and defiance. I don't know what you're talking about. Scout's growl deepened, and Daniels stepped forward, his badge visible. You might want to think carefully about your next words, Daniels said, his voice steady, because lying to an officer is only going to make this worse for you. The man hesitated, his eyes locked on Scout. Fine, he muttered. I used to work for them, okay, but I got out. I didn't want to be part of it anymore. Who's them? Robert pressed. The man looked around nervously before leaning in closer. It's a bigger operation than you think. They're not just running dog fights, they're trafficking animals, smuggling them across state lines. Scout was probably supposed to be sold to someone with more money than sense. Robert's fists clenched, and even Daniel struggled to keep his composure. And where are they now? Daniels demanded. The man glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. I don't know exactly, but there's a warehouse on the edge of town. They used it as a base before. Maybe they're still there. Daniels exchanged a glance with Robert, the air between them heavy with unspoken determination. You've done the right thing by telling us, Daniels said, though his tone carried an edge. Now get out of here, and don't let me see you again. As the man scurried away, Robert turned to Daniels. What now? Daniels tapped his radio, his expression resolute. Now, we make sure no other dog has to go through what Scout did. As the man's figure disappeared into the distance, the gravity of the situation settled over Robert, and Daniels, Scout, ever alert, remained at Robert's side, his tail swishing, as though he sensed the shift in the air. For Robert, this moment was a mixture of hope and apprehension. The address might be a lead, but confronting it could mean open a Pandora's box of horrors. Daniel stood with his hand on his hip, his fingers brushing against his holstered weapon. He was no stranger to danger, but the idea of walking into what could be a full-blown animal trafficking operation was daunting even for a seasoned officer. Oh, you don't have to do this alone, Robert said, suddenly breaking the silence. Daniels looked at him, surprised by the offer. You're not exactly in a position to storm a warehouse, he said, gesturing to Robert's wheelchair. And it's not safe. Robert gave him a knowing look. I didn't say I'd storm the place. I said you don't have to do this alone, Scout, and I can help in other ways. Daniels sighed, his professional instincts clashing with the undeniable bond forming between them. All right, he conceded, but you stay back and you let me handle the heavy lifting. Robert nodded, grateful for the compromise. Fair enough. What's the plan? Daniels tapped his radio, calling in for backup. Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I need a unit to meet me near the old warehouse district on the edge of town. Possible illegal activity. Approach with caution. The response came quickly. Copy that. Daniels' unit en route. Scout tilted his head as if understanding that things were about to escalate. Robert ran a hand through the dog's fur, his voice steady. You ready for this? Boy Scout let out a soft bark, his eyes shining with determination. The tree made their way to the warehouse and Daniels' patrol car, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing mile. As they neared the address, the desolation of the area became apparent. Broken street lights cast faint shadows over cracked pavement, and the hulking silhouette of the warehouse loomed ominously against the night sky. Daniels parked a safe distance away, his headlights off to avoid drawing attention. He glanced at Robert, who sat quietly in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the warehouse. If things go sideways, you stay put, Daniels said firmly. Robert smirked. I'm not reckless, officer. The backup unit arrived moments later, and Daniels briefed his fellow officers on the situation. They agreed to approach cautiously, splitting into two groups to cover the perimeter. Scout stays with me, Robert said, as Daniels handed him a police radio. He knows how to pick up on things we might miss. Daniels hesitated, but Yulee nodded. Fine, but keep him close. As the officers moved toward the warehouse, Scout's ears perked up and his nose teeth twitched. He pulled gently at Robert's wheelchair, guiding him toward a side entrance that the officers had overlooked. Looks like he found something, Robert whispered into the radio. Daniels turned toward them, his brows furrowed. What is it? Robert pointed to the entrance, a rusted metal door slightly ajar. Scout seems to think there's something in there. Daniels motioned for one of the officers to join him as he Approached the door. He pushed it open slowly, the creak echoing in the still night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete. And something else, something acrid and metallic. Scout let out a low growl, his body tense. Robert tightened his grip on the leash. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Daniels scanned the room with his flashlight, revealing rows of cages stacked against the walls. Most were empty, but a few contained frightened animals, dogs, cats, and even exotic birds. Their eyes reflected the beam of light, wide with fear. "Dispatch, this is Daniels," he said into his radio. "We've got evidence of animal trafficking, requesting animal control and additional units." As the officers moved further into the warehouse, they heard muffled voices from an adjacent room. Daniel signaled for silence and motioned for the group to spread out. He approached the door, carefully pressing his ear against it to listen. "They're onto us," a gruff voice said. "We need to move the rest of the stock tonight." Another voice replied, panicked, "There's no time, the roads are being watched." Daniel stepped back, his jaw tight. He gestured for the officers to get into position, turning to Robert. He whispered, "Stay back." Robert nodded, but couldn't help feeling a surge of adrenaline. A scout remained alert by his side. The officers burst into the room, their weapons DRA. Police hands where we can see them. The men inside froze, their eyes darting around for an escape. One of them bolted toward a back exit, but Scout sprang into action. He lunged forward, barking loudly, and blocked the man's path. The sight of the dog's bare teeth stopped him in his tracks. "Down, Scout," Robert commanded, and the dog obeyed instantly, his body still tense, but no longer aggressive. The officers moved swiftly, handcuffing the suspects and securing the room. Daniels turned to Robert, his expression a mix of gratitude and respect. "Your dog's got instincts," he said. Robert smiled, his eyes glistening. "He's been through a lot. He knows when something's wrong." As the suspects were led away and the animals began to be freed, Daniels couldn't help but feel that this night had changed something about the case, about himself, and about the bond between a man and his dog. As the suspects were hauled away in police cruisers, the warehouse felt strangely quiet. The officers worked diligently to document evidence, photograph the scene, and catalog the frightened animals waiting to be rescued. Scout sat by Robert's side, his ears perked up as if still anticipating danger. Daniels approached Robert, crouching to meet his gaze. "You and Scout were indispensable tonight. That door, we might not have found it without him." Robert gave a small smile, his fingers brushing through Scout's fur. "He's smarter than me sometimes," he joked, "but what happens now? These animals deserve more than just being removed from this hellhole." Daniels nodded, his brow furrowed. "Animal control is on the way. They'll evaluate and transport the animals, but it's not always a happy ending for all of them. Not all shelters have resources to handle cases like this." Robert's expression darkened. "That's not right. After everything they've been through, they deserve a chance to find real homes." Daniels sighed, leaning against a rusted metal beam. "That's the reality we deal with, Robert. We save them from one nightmare, only to struggle finding solutions on the other end." Scout let out a soft whine, leaning his head on Robert's leg, as if sensing his distress. "What if we could do more?" Robert asked, suddenly, his tone resolute. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Robert looked down at Scout, inspiration sparking in his eyes. "I've been through hell myself, officer, lost so much, and it felt like there was nothing left. But then Scout came along and changed everything. What if these animals could do the same for others?" Daniels tilted his head, intrigued. "You're suggesting what, a rehabilitation program, therapy animals?" Robert nodded. "Exactly, a sanctuary that doesn't just house them, but gives them a purpose. People who need them as much as they need a second chance. Veterans, seniors, kids in need of emotional support." Crossed his arms, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's an ambitious idea, Robert." "It's more than an idea," Robert replied, his voice firm. "It's a solution. These animals don't just need saving, they need healing. And people like me, we need them just as much." Before Daniels could respond, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed through the warehouse. A black SUV pulled up, and a middle-aged woman stepped out, her demeanor commanding. She wore a badge clipped to her belt and carried a clipboard. "That's Monica," Daniels said, gesturing toward her. "She's with the county's animal welfare unit. She'll take it from here." As Monica approached, she gave Daniels a brisk nod before addressing Robert. "I've been briefed on the Situation, you're the one who found that door. Robert gestured to Scout. It was his. Nose not mine. Monica's sharp features softened as she knelt down to pet Scout. You've got a good one here, she said warmly before turning back to Robert. We'll make sure these animals get medical attention and shelter, but we're stretched thin. This many rescues will overwhelm our system. Robert's jaw tightened. Then let me help. I have some land outside town, a few unused buildings. If I can turn them into a temporary sanctuary, can we work together? Monica hesitated, clearly intrigued but cautious. That's a generous offer, but it's a lot of responsibility. These animals need proper care. Funding. Volunteers, I'll figure it out. Robert interjected. I owe Scout my life. This is the least I can do. Daniels watched the exchange, admiration flickering in his eyes. You might have more support than you think. He said, I know a few people who'd be willing to help out, and I've got some free time when I'm not on shift. Monica smiled faintly. All right, if you're serious, I'll arrange for the first batch of animals to be transferred tomorrow, but you'll need to prove this is more than just a nice idea. It's more than that, Robert replied, his voice steady. It's a promise. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of activity. Monica's team arrived with transport vans, carefully loading the animals and ensuring their safety. Daniel stayed to oversee the operation, keeping an eye on Robert, who was already jotting down plans on a notepad. Scout seemed to sense the shift in his owner's energy, wagging his tail as he stayed close. The once hesitant dog had found his purpose, and now Robert was determined to give the same opportunity to others. By the time the last van drove away, the warehouse was empty, its silence now filled with potential rather than despair. Robert turned to Daniels, a determined glint in his eyes. This is just the beginning. Daniels clapped him on the shoulder. You're a stubborn man, Robert, but I think that's exactly what this town and those animals need. The next morning, the sun rose over Robert's small property, casting a golden light on the rundown barn and empty fields. The quiet serenity felt at odds with the task ahead. Scout sat by Robert's side as he studied a crude blueprint he had sketched on a scrap of paper. All right, boy, Robert said, running a hand through Scout's fur. We've got some work to do. Not long after Monica arrived with the first transport van, inside were 6 dogs, each in varying states of neglect, matted fur, visible ribs, and weary eyes. Monica's expression was guarded as she stepped out of the van, clipboard in hand. This is what we've got for now. Are you sure you're ready for this? Robert nodded, his resolve unwavering. They deserve a chance. As the dogs were carefully unloaded, one in particular caught Scout's attention, a trembling, scrappy terrier with patches of missing fur. The terrier growled faintly, its tail tucked between its legs. Scout stood still, his head tilted in curiosity, before giving a gentle wag of his tail. The terrier's growl softened, and it cautiously sniffed the air, watching Scout. Looks like you've got a helper already, Monica said, a hint of amusement in her voice. I think they understand each other, Robert replied, watching his Scout lay down, inching closer to the terrier without threatening it. The interaction sparked a fleeting hope in Robert. If Scout can come back from where he was, maybe this little guy can too. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway interrupted the moment Daniel stepped out of his car, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a bag of dog food in the other. Figured you might need some help, Robert smirked. You don't strike me as the handyman type. Daniels chuckled. Leighton, just say, I know how to follow instructions, and besides, someone's got to keep an eye on you. Throughout the day, the property came alive with activity. Monica guided Robert and Daniels on how to set up makeshift kennels in the barn, emphasizing the importance of clean bedding, fresh water, and secure fencing. The dogs watched from their temporary enclosures, their eyes wary but curious. Robert felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier as the hours passed. As much as he wanted to save them, all the reality of their needs was overwhelming. Supplies were already running low, and the barn, with its creaky wooden beams and drafty walls, was far from an ideal shelter. By late afternoon, Robert sat on a bale of hay, his head in his hand. Scout lay beside him, resting his head on Robert's boot as if sensing his distress. Monica approached, her voice gentle. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. Most people wouldn't even attempt what you're doing. Robert looked up, his expression tired but determined. These animals don't have anyone else. If I give up, what happens to them? Monica hesitated before sitting beside him. You can't save every dog, Robert, but for the ones you do, Save it means everything their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the barn door. One of the dogs, a lanky mutt with a reddish coat, had managed to slip out of its enclosure and was darting around the property. Scout sprang into action, barking softly as he herded the dog away from the road. And back toward the barn, watching Scout's careful movements, Robert felt a surge of gratitude for his four-legged companion. "That dog is braver than I am," he muttered. Daniels, who had been hammering a piece of fencing into place, overheard and smirked. "He's got your stubbornness, that's for sure," as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. The first day ended with a mixture of exhaustion. An accomplishment. The barn, though still a work in progress, now housed the rescued dogs in clean, safe spaces. Scout patrolled the area, checking on each dog, as if taking on the role of caretaker. That night, as Robert sat by the fire pit outside his modest home, Monica and Daniels joined him. The air was cool, and the crackling flames provided a comforting backdrop to their conversation. "You've started something good here," Daniel said, his voice sincere, "but you're going to need more than good intentions to keep it going." Monica nodded. "There are grants for animal rescue operations, and I can connect you with some local vets who might offer discounted services, but this can't just be a solo mission, Robert. You'll need a team." Robert stared into the flames, his mind racing with possibilities. "I'll do whatever it takes. These animals deserve a fighting chance." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Even if it means asking for help?" Robert chuckled wryly. "Even then," Monica smiled, "good, because you're going to need all the help you can get." As the fire burned lower, the three of them sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. In the distance, the soft sounds of the dogs settling in for the night filled the air, a reminder of the lives they had already begun to change. The next morning dawned with a quiet urgency. Robert was up before sunrise, double-checking the makeshift kennels and refilling water bowls. Scouts stayed close, moving with purpose, as though understanding the weight of the mission. As the town began to stir, a sense of unease crept over Robert. Monica had mentioned the previous day that not everyone in the area supported rescue efforts. Some saw stray dogs as a nuisance, or worse, a threat to livestock and property values. The thought net him, but he pushed it aside. He had no time for doubters. Monica arrived mid-morning with another load of supplies, her face tight with concern. "I got a call from someone at the city shelter," she began as she handed Robert a clipboard. "There's talk in town about what you're doing here. A few people aren't happy." Robert frowned, flipping through the paperwork. "What's their problem? It's not like these dogs are bothering anyone. They think they will," Monica said, lowering her voice. "There's a group of locals who've been complaining about strays for years. They don't want a rescue operation in their backyard, and if they make enough noise, the county could shut this whole thing down." Robert gritted his teeth. He had suspected resistance, but wasn't prepared for organized opposition. "Let them come, I'll deal with them." Daniels pulled up moments later, stepping out of his truck with a newspaper tucked under his arm. "You might want to read this," he said, handing it to Robert. The front page headline made his stomach drop. "Local man's dog shelter sparks controversy." The article detailed the rescue effort, but painted a mixed picture, emphasizing the concerns of nearby residents over potential noise, disease, and property devaluation. Several quotes from anonymous sources were particularly harsh, accusing Robert of inviting trouble into the community. Anonymous Robert muttered, his jaw tightening. "Cowards." Monica leaned over to scan the article. "This kind of publicity can go both ways. It might bring in more support, or it might make things worse." Scout barked, suddenly drawing their attention to the driveway. A sleek black SUV rolled up, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, his demeanor screaming authority. "Mr. Gray," the man called, holding up a badge. "I, Officer Stevens with Animal Control." Robert's stomach sank. He nodded, stepping forward. "What can I do for you?" "We've received complaints about a large number of animals on your property," Stevens said, his tone professional but cold. "I'm here to ensure everything is up to code." Robert felt his temper flare, but kept it in check. "You're welcome to take a look. We followed all the guidelines Monica provided." Stevens raised an eyebrow, but followed Robert through the barn, clipboard in hand. As he inspected the kennels, he made notes but offered no feedback, the dogs sensing his unfamiliar presence barked nervously. Scout stayed close to Robert, his gaze fixed on the officer. After an excruciating half hour, Stevens closed his clipboard. "You're set up is adequate for now, he said, but I'll need to see a detailed plan for long-term care and expansion if you intend to keep this many animals. And keep in mind, if more complaints come in, we'll have to reevaluate, Monica stepped. In her voice, steady. Mr. Gray has been working tirelessly to ensure these animals are cared for properly. Isn't that what we should be encouraging? Stevens gave her a pointed look. The law is the law, ma'am. I'm just here to enforce it. As the SUV drove away, Robert let out a frustrated sigh. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Monica nodded. Probably, but it also means you're on their radar, which could be a good thing if you keep everything above board. Daniel slapped Robert on the back. You've faced worse, you've got this. But Robert couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the obstacles were only growing. He spent the rest of the day reviewing paperwork, creating a detailed expansion plan, and researching permits. Scout stayed by his side, his steady presence a small comfort. By evening, another challenge emerged. As Robert walked the property, he noticed movement near the edge of the tree line. At first, he thought it was a stray, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something else entirely: a small group of teenagers loitering near the fence. One of them held a spray, shaking it aggressively. Hey, Robert called out, his voice firm. What do you think you're doing? The teenagers froze, startled. One of them, a lanky boy with a defiant smirk, stepped forward. Just leaving a message, old man, he sneered, gesturing to the freshly painted graffiti on the fence. No dogs here. Scout barked sharply, his posture alert but non-threatening. The sound seemed to unnerve the group, and they quickly retreated into the woods. Robert inspected the vandalism. His chest tightening. The words felt like a direct attack on everything he was trying to build. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo before heading back to the barn. Monica was still there cleaning up supplies when she saw his expression. She frowned. What happened? More opposite position, Robert muttered, showing her the photo. Looks like this fight's going to get uglier. Monica's eyes hardened. Then we'll fight back with the truth. Let me handle the media. We'll turn this around. Robert nodded, his resolve returning. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about these dogs and proving they deserve better. The days following the vandalism incident were tense but productive. Monica, true to her word, launched a media-C campaign to counter the growing resistance. She reached out to local news outlets, inviting them to visit the shelter and share stories of the rescued dogs. Within a week, 2 reporters arrived with cameras and notebooks ready to document the progress. Robert felt a mix of anxiety and determination as he guided them through the barn. Scout trotted beside him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Robert's nerves. This is Scout, Robert said, patting the dog's head. He's the reason I started this whole thing. The reporters leaned in, intrigued. Tell us his story, one of them prompted. Robert hesitated for a moment, then shared the tale of how Scout had come into his life, the abandoned pup, the struggles they faced together, and the bond that had saved them both. As he spoke, he noticed the camera crew capturing every word, their lenses focused not just on Scout, but on the man who had given him a second chance. Meanwhile, Monica ushered the reporters toward the kennels where the other dogs were resting or playing. She introduced them to individual animals, sharing their backstories with heartfelt detail. There was Daisy, a timid terrier who had survived a neglectful home, and Rocky, a spirited shepherd mix who had once been chained outside in freezing temperatures. Each story was a testament to resilience and the importance of second chances. As the media coverage began to gain traction, public opinion started to shift. Positive comments flooded social media, with many locals expressing support for the shelter. Donations trickled in small amounts at first, but enough to make a difference. Encouraged by the response, Monica and Robert organized an open house event to welcome the community and showcase their work. The day of the open house, the shelter buzzed with activity. Volunteers set up tables with informational pamphlets, adoption forms, and merchandise to raise funds. Scout stood proudly by the entrance, wearing a bandana that read, "Adopt, don't shop too." Robert surprised, familiar faces began to appear among the crowd. Daniels arrived with his wife and children, who immediately gravitated toward the dogs. "This place looks great," Daniel said, clapping Robert on the shoulder. "You've come a long way." Monica's efforts to reach out to skeptics also bore fruit. Among the attendees were a few of the neighbors who had initially voiced concerns. One woman, Mrs. Carter, approached Robert hesitantly. "I wasn't sure about all this at first," she admitted, glancing around the bustling barn. but seeing it in person, it's impressive, Robert offered. A small smile. It's not just about the dogs, it's about proving they're worth the effort. Mrs. Carter nodded her expression. Softening, I think you're doing something good here. Let me know if you need help. The event was a success with several dogs finding new homes and enough donations raised to cover immediate expenses as the last of the visitors trickled out. Robert felt a glimmer of hope that the tide was turning that evening. As Robert cleaned up, he noticed Scout sitting by the barn door, staring out into the distance. Curious, he walked over and followed the dog's gaze. In the fading light, he saw the figure of a young boy standing near the fence, the same boy who had defaced it days earlier. The boy froze when saw Robert approach, clearly debating whether to run. Instead, Robert stopped a few feet away and spoke calmly. You've been here before. The boy fidgeted but didn't respond. Robert crouched down, making himself less intimidating. You know, everyone deserves a chance to make things right. That includes you. The boy looked up, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. I didn't mean anything by it. My dad says dogs like these are dangerous. Robert nodded slowly. I've heard people say that, but have you ever spent time with a dog like Scout? The boy shook his head. Then maybe it's time you did, Robert said, gesturing for Scout to come over. The dog approached cautiously, sensing the boy's nervousness. Scout's been through a lot, but he's one of the gentlest dogs you'll ever meet. Go ahead, give him a pat. Hesitantly, the boy extended his hand. Scout sniffed it, then leaned in, wagging his tail. A small smile broke across the boy's face as he stroked the dog's fur. See, Robert said, not so dangerous after all. The boy nodded, his defenses lowering. I guess not. As the boy walked away, Robert felt a surge of hope. It wasn't just about changing minds, it was about building bridges, one interaction at a time. A few weeks after the open house, the shelter's momentum was building, but so were its challenges. The shelter received a steady influx of dogs, each with their own heartbreaking story, while Monica worked tirelessly to handle the growing public interest and manage volunteers. Robert struggled to keep up with the day-to-day care of the animals. One particularly busy morning, Robert found Scout sitting by the barn door again, his ears perked this time. Scout was growling softly, his focus fixed on something in the distance. Following his gaze, Robert spotted two men standing near the fence. They weren't locals, he could tell by their demeanor and the unmarked truck parked nearby. Robert's gut twisted with unease. He approached cautiously. Scout at his side. Can I help you? Robert called out. One of the men, tall with a rough demeanor, smirked. Heard you've got a lot of dogs here. Thought we'd check it out. This is private property, Robert replied firmly. If you're interested in adopting, you'll need to come back during open hours. The shorter man chucked L, leaning casually against the fence. We're not here for that. You see, some folks think this shelter's more trouble than it's worth. Noisy dogs, dirty animals, you get the picture. Robert's jaw tightened. We're following all regulations. If you've got a problem, take it up with the authorities. Oh, we will, the tall man sneered. But until then, maybe think about how long you can keep this place running with so much opposition. Scout growled louder, his stance protective. The men exchanged glances and backed away, but not before the shorter one added, careful who you trust, Trent. Not everyone's rooting for you. As the truck rumbled away, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random visit. He suspected these men were hired by someone who wanted the shelter shut down, perhaps a disgruntled neighbor or someone unhappy with the shelter's growing visibility. Later that day, Monica burst into the barn, holding her phone. Robert, you're not going to believe this. She handed him the phone, which displayed a social media post accusing the shelter of neglect and poor conditions. The post featured photos of sickly dogs and dirty kennels, photos that Robert immediately recognized as fake. For who posted this? Robert asked, his voice sharp. An anonymous account, Monica replied, but it's spreading fast. People are commenting, sharing. It's bad. Robert felt a wave of anger and frustration. The timing was too perfect. It had to be connected to the men he'd seen earlier. We can't let this go unanswered. Monica nodded. I've already reached out to our supporters, asking them to post positive reviews and photos, but we need something bigger to counteract this. Robert thought for a moment, then said, what about a live stream? We'll show people exactly what the shelter looks like in real time. The next morning, Monica set up a camera in the barn, broadcasting live to the shelter's social media page. Robert stood in front of the camera, flanked by Scout and a few other dogs. Good morning, everyone. Robert began, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. I'm Robert Trent, and this is my shelter. Recently, some false accusations have been made against us claiming we don't care for our animals properly. I want to show you the truth," the camera panned across the barn, capturing the clean kennels and the fresh food and water and the happy, healthy dogs wagging their tails. Monica narrated in the background, pointing out the improvements they'd made with the donations they'd received. As the live stream continued, comments flooded and supporters voiced their encouragement while skeptics admitted the shelter looked far better than the misleading photos had suggested. The video gained traction, reaching thousands of viewers within hours. By the end of the day, the shelter's reputation was not only restored, but bolstered. Donations increased and more volunteers signed up to help. However, Robert knew this wasn't the end of their challenges. That evening, as Robert locked up the barn, he found Scout pacing near the back door, whining softly. Following the dog, Robert discovered a small, crumpled note wedged under the door frame. He unfolded it and read the hastily scrolled words, "Leave while you still can next time. It won't just be words." Robert's grip tightened on the paper as he looked down at Scout. "They're trying to scare us, boy," he muttered, "but they don't know who they're dealing with." Scout barked softly as if in agreement. The note Robert found weighed heavily on his mind as he prepared for another day at the shelter. He couldn't ignore the threat, but he also couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he channeled his eyes into action. It was time to confront whoever was behind the campaign against the shelter. Monica, always one step ahead, suggested a proactive approach. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, placing a stack of flyers on the table. "Let's host a community event, a dog adoption fair. We'll invite local businesses, law enforcement, and media. The more people see the good work we're doing, the harder it'll be for anyone to spread lies." Robert hesitated. "Do you think it's safe? Whoever left that note might try something. We'll take precautions," Monica replied firmly. "And besides, letting them scare us into hiding isn't an option." As preparations for the event ramped up, tensions continued to simmer. The shelter received more anonymous threats, and Robert noticed unfamiliar cars idling near the property at odd hours. Despite this, support for the shelter grew. Local businesses donated supplies, and volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare the barn for the fair. The day of the event dawned sunny and warm. Brightly colored banners lined the driveway, and rows of tables showcased adoption forms, merchandise, and information about the shelter. Monica had even arranged for a food truck and a pet grooming station, adding to the festive atmosphere. Scout, and wearing a fresh bandana, sat proudly near the entrance. As visitors began to arrive, children flocked to him, and he responded with gentle tail wags and soft nudges. Robert scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on a group of uniformed officers who had stopped by. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached with a nod. "Looks like you've got a good turnout. Thanks for coming," Robert said, shaking his hand. "I wasn't sure how this would go." Daniels gave a small smile. "You've got a lot of support in this town, Trent. Don't let a few bad apples ruin that." As preparations for the event ramped up, tensions continued to simmer. The shelter received more anonymous threats, and Robert noticed unfamiliar cars idling near the property at odd hours. Despite this, support for the shelter grew. Local businesses donated supplies, and volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare the barn for the fair. The day of the event dawned sunny and warm. Brightly colored banners lined the driveway, and rows of tables showcased adoption forms, merchandise, and information about the shelter. Monica had even arranged for a food truck and a pet grooming station, adding to the festive atmosphere. Scout, and wearing a fresh bandana, sat proudly near the entrance. As visitors began to arrive, children flocked to him, and he responded with gentle tail wags and soft nudges. Robert scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on a group of uniformed officers who had stopped by. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached with a nod. "Looks like you got a good turnout. Thanks for coming," Robert said, shaking his hand. "I wasn't sure how this would go." Daniels gave a small smile. "You've got a lot of support in this town, Trent. Don't let a few bad apples ruin that." Evening, after the event concluded, Robert and Monica sat in the barn surrounded by sleeping dogs and the remnants of a successful day. Scout lay at Robert's feet, his presence a comforting reminder of why they were fighting so hard. "We need to find out who's behind this," Robert said, his voice low. "That man didn't just show up on his own." Monica nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. Lead and start with the license plate. Daniels might be able to help." The next day, Robert met with Officer Daniels and shared the plate number. Daniels promised to look into it discreetly, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. A few days later, Daniels called with an update. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "The cars registered to a private security firm, and guess who hired them? One of your neighbors, Mr. Carter." Robert's jaw tightened. Mr. Carter had been one of the most vocal opponents of the shelter since its inception. "What's his motive?" "Hard to say," Daniels replied, "but I'd bet it has something to do with property values. People like him only see numbers, not lives." Robert thanked Daniels and hung up his resolve, hardening. It was time to confront Mr. Carter. That evening, Robert stood at Mr. Carter's front door, Scout by his side. When Carter opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. "Robert, what brings you here?" "I know you've been trying to shut us down," Robert said bluntly. "Hiring people to intimidate us, spreading lies. It stops now." Carter stiffened. "You can't prove anything." Robert held his ground. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to tell you that no matter what you do, the shelter isn't going anywhere. We've got the community support, and we're doing good work. You can either get on board or keep wasting your energy fighting us." Carter said nothing, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes told Robert his words had landed. As Robert walked away, Scout trotting beside him, he felt a renewed sense of a purpose. They were up against powerful forces, but with determination and community support, he knew they could weather the storm. The confrontation with Mr. Carter weighed on Robert's mind as he returned to the shelter. He knew Carter wasn't acting alone, and the man's silence only confirmed his suspicion, but Robert also knew that the shelter was stronger than ever thanks to the day's community support at the adoption fair. A week later, Robert was in the barn, tending to a new group of residential, when Monica burst in holding a stack of papers. "You need to see this," she said, her voice urgent. She handed him a flyer with bold, inflammatory accusations against the shelter printed across the top. The flyer had been anonymously distributed to mailboxes all over town. "Unsafe conditions, exploitation of animals, and fraud." Robert read aloud, his stomach sinking. "They're doubling down." Monica nodded. "And there's more. Carter's group is organizing a town meeting next week to call for the shelter's closure." Robert sighed and leaned against the stall door. "We need a plan, Monica. We can't let them win." Monica placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's fight back with the truth." The week leading up to the meeting was a whirlwind of preparation. Robert and Monica gathered evidence of the shelter's impact, records of successful adoptions, testimonials from families, and a detailed breakdown of the shelter's fin. To counter the accusations of fraud, they also reached out to local media outlets, inviting them to cover the meeting. On the day of the meeting, Robert arrived at the town hall early. The room quickly filled with people, many holding signs in support of the shelter, while a smaller but vocal group stood near the back, led by Mr. Carter. Scout sat quietly by Robert's side, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The meeting began with Carter taking the floor. He presented a slideshow filled with distorted images and misleading statistics, painting the shelter as a blight on the community. As he spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. When Carter finished, the moderator called Robert to the podium. He stood, his heart pounding, but as he looked out at the crowd, he saw familiar faces, families who had adopted from the shelter, volunteers who had spent count hours caring for the animals, and even Officer Daniels, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Robert took a deep breath. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here to defend the truth." He started by addressing the financial accusations, displaying spreadsheets and receipts that showed every dollar donated had been used to benefit the animals. He shared photos of happy, healthy dogs in their new homes and played a video montage of families sharing how their lives have been transformed by their adoptions. "But this isn't just about numbers," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about community. It's about giving animals like Scout a second chance and bringing people together." He gestured towards Scout, who wagged his tail and stood, earning a round of applause from the audience. Scout was once a stray, written off by society, but now he's a therapy dog helping kids in schools and hospitals. "That's what we do here. We see potential where others see problems." As Robert spoke, the energy in the room shifted. People who had been on the fence began nodding, their skepticism melting away. Even some of Carter's supporters lowered their signs, their expressions softening. When Robert finished, the room erupted in applause, but before he could step down, a young girl in the front row raised her hand. "Can I say something?" The moderator nodded, and the girl stood clutching a framed photo. "This is Lucy," she said, holding up the picture of a golden retriever. "We adopted her from the shelter last year. She's my best friend, and she helped me when I was scared to go to school. Without the shelter, I wouldn't have her." Tears filled Robert's eyes as more people stood to share their stories. A single mother spoke about how a rescued dog had helped her autistic son communicate for the first time. An elderly man shared how his adopted dog had brought him companionship after his wife passed away. Carter Viss, visibly uncomfortable, tried to interject, but the crowd wasn't having it. "We've heard enough from you," someone shouted, and others murmured in agreement. The moderator eventually called for a vote on whether the shelter should remain open. Hands shot up across the room in overwhelming support. Carter's group, outnumbered and silenced, left in defeat. As the crowd dispersed, Robert and Monica stayed behind to gather their materials. Officer Daniels approached with a smile. "You did it, Robert. You showed them the truth." Robert looked down at Scout, who nudged his hand with a soft bark. "We all did it. This wasn't just me." The shelter not only remained open, but thrived. Donations poured in, and new volunteers signed up to help. The events of the meeting became a turning point, not just for the shelter, but for the entire community. Robert stood in the barn a few weeks later watching Scout play with a group of newly adopted dogs. "You did good, buddy," he said, patting Scout's head. "We all did." Scout wagged his tail as if to say he agreed. The warmth of the sun filtered through the barn windows as Robert stood with Scout by his side, reflecting on how far they had come. The shelter, once the target of baseless accusations, was now thriving, its reputation stronger than ever. The battle they had fought wasn't just for the animals, it was for the heart of the community, a fight to prove that compassion and truth could overcome prejudice and greed. In the weeks following the town meeting, the shelter saw an outpouring of support. Donations arrived from across the region, many accompanied by heartfelt letters from people inspired by the story of Scout and the shelter's resilience. Families who had adopted from the shelter volunteered their time, helping with everything from cleaning kennels to organizing adoption events. The local press ran follow-up stories highlighting the shelter's impact, cementing its place as a cherished part of the community. Robert noticed a change in the people around him. Neighbors who had once ignored the shelter now stopped by with supplies or just to visit the animals. Even Officer Daniels, who had once sprayed Scout with pepper spray, became a regular visitor, often bringing his son to play with the dogs. One afternoon, Monica approached Robert with a folder in hand. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her face glowing with excitement. Inside was a proposal from a local business consortium offering to fund the expansion of the shelter. They wanted to build a new wing dedicated to training therapy dogs inspired by Scout story. Robert smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "This is incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Scout, looks like you're going to have some company." The shelter's transformation extended beyond its physical space. Robert and Monica organized community outreach programs, teaching children about animal care and the importance of kindness. Scout became the face of these programs, visiting schools and hospitals, spreading joy wherever he went. His story served as a powerful reminder of the impact one animal could have, not just on a single person, but on an entire community. One day during an adoption event at the park, a young boy approached Scout with a hesitant smile. "Is he the dog from the story?" he asked, looking up at Robert. "He sure is," Robert replied, kneeling beside Scout. "And he'd love to meet you." The boy knelt down, and Scout gently nudged his hand, earning a giggle. "I want to help dogs like him someday," the boy said, his voice filled with determination. Robert's heart swelled. "You can. Kindness and courage can change the world, one paw at a time." As the sun set over the shelter that evening, Robert stood by the barn, watching the animals play in the yard. Monica joined him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice filled with pride. "We have." Robert agreed, his eyes on Scout, who was now playing with a group of puppies. "It's amazing what can happen when people come together for a good cause." The shelter became a beacon of hope, its story spreading far beyond the town. But for Robert, the real victory was seeing the joy in the faces of the animals and the people whose lives they touched. It was in the wagging tails of the dogs who found their forever homes in the laughter of children playing with their new furry friends, and in the quiet moments of connection that reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. As Robert locked up the barn for the night, Scout trotted over his tail, wagging. Robert knelt down, rubbing the dog's ears. "We did good, didn't we, buddy?" Scout licked his face in response. His eyes full of loyalty and love, Robert stood looking out at the star's wheel. "Keep going," he said softly, "for every animal that needs a second chance, and for every person who needs to learn what love and kindness can do." If this story moved you, consider how you can make a difference in the lives of animals. Whether it's adopting, volunteering, or simply spreading the word, every action counts. Share this story with someone who loves animals as much as you do, and help us continue the mission of kindness and second chances. And if you enjoyed this story, don't miss our next heartwarming tale. Click here to watch now.